Pack what you need by morning. Hugo Hadwick said it without looking up from his phone, leaning against the doorframe of the study like he owned the world, which, as of tomorrow's will reading, he was fairly certain he would. The lawyer's at 9. Once it's done, I'll need you gone by the afternoon. Lenora Hadwick sat very still in the armchair by the window. Outside, Vancouver's October rain dragged down the glass in long gray sheets. She looked at her husband of 11 years and tried to remember the last time he'd spoken to her with anything resembling warmth. She couldn't. I've spoken to my lawyer, Hugo continued, finally setting his phone on the side table. The prenuptial agreement is clean. You walk away with your personal belongings and whatever's in your own accounts, which if I remember correctly, isn't much. He smiled at that, a tight, satisfied thing. I've already found you a place in Burnaby, month-to-month lease. It'll give you time to figure out your next move. Lenora looked at her hands folded in her lap. She thought about the prenup. She'd signed it 11 years ago in a fog of being 26 years old, and so deeply certain that Hugo Hadwick was the man she was going to spend her whole life with. His mother, Millicent, had actually pulled her aside the afternoon before the signing and told her to get her own solicitor to review it. Lenora had laughed it off. She'd been too in love to read the fine print. Paige is coming over tonight, Hugo said, like it was the most ordinary thing. To celebrate. I'd rather not have you underfoot. Lenora finally looked up. Paige Allard was 28. She designed low-rise residential projects at Hugo's firm. She'd been to their house twice for work functions, and both times she'd looked at Lenora with a kind of pity that, in retrospect, was not pity at all. You can use the basement, Hugo added. The couch down there is fine. He picked up his phone again. He was already done with the conversation. Lenora understood she had been dismissed. She stood slowly and walked out of the study without saying a word. 2 years. That's how long this had been unraveling if she was honest with herself. She'd started suspecting the affair about 14 months ago. She'd confirmed it 7 months after that, finding a text thread on Hugo's iPad that he'd left open by accident on the kitchen counter, or maybe not by accident. Maybe by that point he simply hadn't cared enough to hide it. She hadn't confronted him. She'd gone very still inside. The way you go still when you've been underwater for too long, and finally accept that the surface is further than you thought. What had kept her going through all of it was Millicent. 2 years ago, Millicent Hadwick had a stroke. It happened at her office. She'd been reviewing the quarterly statements for Hadwick Property Group, the real estate development company she'd built from a single fourplex in East Vancouver 41 years ago. By the time the ambulance arrived, her left side was compromised and her speech had gone blurry at the edges, the words she wanted sliding away before she could catch them. Hugo had wanted to move her to a memory care facility immediately. She's 74, Lenora. What are we supposed to do? Build a hospital in the spare room? He'd said it the morning after Millicent was discharged, not 3 feet from where his mother was sitting. Lenora had looked at him that morning, and felt something shift permanently behind her ribs. She'd fought him. She rarely fought Hugo about anything back then, but she'd fought him on this and she'd won. And Millicent had moved into the downstairs bedroom with its wide window that looked out over the back garden. The first few weeks had been difficult. Millicent was frustrated in the particular way of someone accustomed to moving fast through the world, suddenly slowed to a crawl. She'd wave her good hand in irritation when the words didn't come. She'd refuse help standing and then list sideways and have to accept it anyway. Lenora had been patient with her. She'd learned to follow Millicent's gestures, to wait in the silence until the word arrived, to celebrate the small recoveries. The morning Millicent said coffee without pausing. The afternoon she walked to the end of the block with only the cane and not Lenora's arm. Hugo never came. He was busy at the firm, he said. He'd check in from the door sometimes, a flat obligatory, "How are you feeling, Mom?" and then he'd be gone before she could answer. And so Lenora and Millicent had built something neither of them had expected. They'd watch the rain come in off English Bay from the window in Millicent's room. They'd play cribbage in the evenings. Millicent would tell stories about starting the business in her 30s with no money, and a head full of ideas and a bank manager, who kept telling her women didn't understand commercial real estate, and she'd kept going back to the same man until he'd finally given her the loan just to get rid of her. Never let anyone's small imagination become your ceiling, Millicent told her once, her speech steady and clear by then. About 8 months after the stroke, she'd been looking out the window, not at Lenora, but the words had been for her. You understand me? Their ceiling, not yours. At the time Lenora hadn't fully understood what Millicent meant. She understood it now. She went down to the basement and sat on the old sectional couch that smelled faintly of must and cedar. She could hear, 2 floors up, the front door open and close. Paige's voice, high and bright and young, carrying down through the floorboards. Hugo's laugh, a sound Lenora hadn't heard in the house in longer than she could remember. She sat very still and listened. Upstairs more voices arrived. Hugo had invited people, 3 couples from the firm, from the sound of it, and another man whose voice Lenora didn't recognize. Bottles clinked. Music played softly, something that had been popular last year, that Lenora had always liked but now understood she would never be able to listen to again. "Tomorrow's the day," she heard Hugo say, his voice carrying with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life considered the possibility of losing. Property groups assessed at just over $8 million, plus the condos she held personally, plus all the investment accounts. Mum was old school, kept a lot in GICs, he laughed. "Should have done something more interesting with it, but more for me, right?" Light laughter from the room. "And the wife?" Another man's voice, someone called Pierce. A pause, then Hugo, quieter but still audible. "Gone by tomorrow afternoon. The prenup covers everything. She contributed nothing material to the assets. The firm was in the family 20 years before I was even involved. She has no claim." "That's harsh, man." Pierce didn't sound entirely comfortable. "It's clean," Hugo said. "It was always going to end. Better it ends now when there's something worth protecting." Lenora pulled her knees up to her chest on the couch. Around 11 she heard footsteps on the basement stairs. The door opened and Paige Allard appeared, holding a glass of white wine, wearing one of Hugo's firm's branded fleece pullovers. She stopped when she saw Lenora. "Oh," she said, "I didn't think you'd actually be down here." She looked around the basement with an expression that might have been discomfort. "He actually made you. Wow, that's a bit much, even for him." Lenora said nothing. Paige took a sip of her wine. "Look, I'm not going to pretend I'm the villain here. Hugo and I," she paused, "he hasn't been happy with you for a long time. I didn't manufacture that." "I know," Lenora said quietly. Paige seemed to have expected more resistance. She blinked. "So you're just fine with all of this?" "I'm not fine with it." Lenora looked at her steadily. "But I don't think anything you or I say down here tonight is going to change what's already been decided." Paige studied her for a moment with something that wasn't quite pity, and wasn't quite respect. Then she turned and went back upstairs without another word. Lenora sat in the basement until the voices quieted and the lights went out, and then she sat a while longer. She was thinking about Millicent. 6 weeks before Millicent died, a lawyer had come to the house. Not Hugo's lawyer, a different one, a man Lenora hadn't seen before. He'd arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while Hugo was at the firm, carrying a briefcase and introducing himself only as Reginald Moss, saying he had a 2 o'clock with Mrs. Hadwick. Lenora had helped Millicent dress for the meeting. Her good cardigan, the pearl earrings she wore when she wanted to feel like herself. She'd walked her to the sitting room and given them privacy, closing the door. 2 hours later, the lawyer had emerged and nodded to Lenora with something that felt deliberate. "Thank you for your hospitality," he'd said, in the careful way of someone not legally permitted to say anything else. When Lenora had gone back in to help Millicent with her evening exercises, the old woman had been sitting in the armchair looking tired but, Lenora had thought at the time, satisfied. "The way you look after you've finished something you'd been putting off." "It's arranged," Millicent had said simply. "Everything's arranged now." Lenora had assumed she meant end-of-life paperwork, medical directives, that sort of thing. Now sitting alone in the basement while rain hit the window well, she wondered. Millicent had been a meticulous woman. She'd built an $8 million property portfolio through 41 years of careful, disciplined decisions. She did not do things carelessly. She did not do things halfway. And she had seen Hugo clearly. Lenora knew that because Millicent had told her, not cruelly but plainly, about 8 months before she died. "He's changed," Millicent had said during one of their evening cribbage games. "Or maybe he hasn't changed. Maybe I just stopped making excuses for what was always there." She'd laid down a card. "He's been cutting corners at the firm, billing clients for work that wasn't completed. I know about it, even if he thinks I don't." She'd looked up at Lenora. "I've still got friends in that building, you know, people who call me." Lenora had set down her cards. "Millicent, I'm not asking you to do anything, I'm just telling you." The old woman had met her eyes. "I want you to know that I see things, and I think you should know that someone in this house sees you properly." Lenora had thought about that conversation every day since. She finally slept around 4 in the morning, sideways on the basement couch, still in her clothes. She woke at 7, stiff and hollow-eyed, and went upstairs to shower while the house was still quiet. She chose her gray wool dress, the one she'd bought for a conference back when she'd still been working as an urban planner. Before she'd agreed stupidly she understood now. to quit and support Hugo's career instead. She kept her hair simple. She put on the small gold earrings Millicent had given her for Christmas 2 years ago. The last Christmas Millicent had been well enough to do her own shopping. Hugo was in the kitchen when she came downstairs. He looked at her for a moment in the way of someone who's surprised to find a thing exactly where they left it. "You look composed," he said, meaning something he didn't say out loud. "Shall we go?" she said. Paige was waiting by the car. She'd dressed for the occasion in a camel coat that Lenora recognized as having been in Hugo's closet for the past 8 months. All three of them drove downtown in a silence that was somehow louder than anything that had been said the night before. Reginald Moss's office was on the 14th floor of a glass tower on Burrard Street. The reception area was calm and well appointed. A younger associate showed them to the boardroom. Hugo sat on one side of the table, Paige beside him. Lenora sat across from them. Reginald Moss came in at exactly 9 o'clock, placed his briefcase on the table, and settled himself without any of the warm pleasantries one might have expected. "Thank you for coming," he said, looking at each of them in turn. "Before we begin, I'm required to inform you that this will contain several provisions that are not typical, and that I'm obligated to read the document in its entirety without interruption. Questions may be directed to me afterward." "That's fine," Hugo said, leaning back in his chair. "Let's get it done." Reginald Moss opened his folder. "I, Millicent Constance Hadwick, being of sound mind and judgment, hereby declare this document to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior versions." Hugo nodded along. Paige rested her hand on his forearm. "Before the distribution of my estate, I wish to make several matters of record. First, I want to address concerns that may arise regarding my cognitive capacity following my stroke of 2 years ago. My physician, Dr. Anita Subramaniam, has provided a written attestation to this office confirming that throughout the period of this document's preparation and execution, I was assessed as fully competent. Recordings of my meetings with my solicitor are available as further evidence." Hugo shifted slightly in his chair. Reginald continued. "Second, I want to state clearly that, contrary to what some parties may have assumed, my stroke did not impair my awareness of events occurring around me. I have spent the past 2 years observing my household, my business and my family with full clarity. I kept my own counsel, I gathered information, I made decisions." Lenora felt her heartbeat in her throat. "Third, I must address certain financial matters. It has come to my attention, through sources I will not name here but whose documentation is attached as Schedule A, that my son, Hugo Arthur Hadwick, misappropriated client trust funds held by Hadwick Property Group in the approximate amount of $140,000 over a period of roughly 22 months. Copies of the relevant invoices, wire transfer records and email communications have been provided to the Vancouver office of the RCMP Commercial Crime Unit." Hugo was on his feet before Reginald finished the sentence. "That is an absolute." "Mr. Hadwick." Reginald's voice did not change in pitch or pace. "You will have an opportunity to speak. Please sit down." "My mother was not in her right mind. She was manipulated this document." "Your mother recorded her consultations with this office. Every session, video and audio. You are welcome to view them." He said it the way you say something when you already know what the other person will find when they look. "Please sit down." Hugo sat. His face had gone from red to something closer to gray. Paige had taken her hand off his arm. Reginald continued, reading. "I do not raise the matter of the misappropriated funds to punish my son, though punishment may well follow through other means. I raise it because the beneficiaries of my estate deserve to understand the full context of my decisions. I have loved my son throughout his life despite the many ways in which he has disappointed me. This is not an act of punishment, it is an act of clarity." Lenora's eyes were blurring, she kept them fixed on the table. "I now address the distribution of my estate." Hugo's hands were flat on the table, very still. "To my son Hugo Arthur Hadwick, I leave the contents of the storage unit at Pemberton Road, Lot 17. Items which are his personal property and which were stored there before his marriage. I also leave him the framed photograph of the two of us at his university graduation, which I believe he'll want to keep." Silence. "Everything else." Reginald paused, the practiced pause of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say. "All properties, all company shares, all investment accounts, all liquid assets, all chattels pertaining to the family home, I leave in their entirety and without condition to my daughter-in-law, Lenora Grace Hadwick." The sound Hugo made was not a word. It was something that had started as one and collapsed before it arrived. Paige stood up so abruptly her chair scraped back against the floor. "I'm sorry, what?" Hugo's hand came down flat on the table. This is fraud. She manipulated a sick old woman. She was alone with her for 2 years. She had access to everything. Mr. Hadwick. Reginald reached into his briefcase and withdrew a small tablet. He pressed play. The screen filled with Millicent's face. She was sitting in the very chair Lenora now sat in. This boardroom, on the day Reginald had come to the house with his briefcase. She was wearing her good cardigan. She was wearing the pearl earrings. Her back was straight and her voice was measured and her eyes were as sharp and clear as they had ever been. If you are watching this, Millicent said, then I am gone and Hugo is contesting the will, so let me be very direct. Hugo had gone entirely still. Lenora did not ask me for anything. Not once in 2 years did she hint at what I might leave her, or treat me differently because she knew what I was worth, or suggest that her care for me came with an invoice attached. She looked after me because she is a decent person living inside a situation that was quietly destroying her, and she chose to focus on what she could still give rather than what was being taken from her. Millicent paused to draw a careful breath. I have watched my son for 50 years. I know exactly who he is. I love him and I grieve what he became, but love is not the same thing as blindness and I am not blind. On screen, Millicent folded her hands in her lap, the gesture so familiar that Lenora felt it behind her sternum like a struck bell. Lenora is the kind of person I spent 40 years trying to build a company worthy of. I am giving her that company. I am giving her everything I built, not as a gift, as recognition. She looked directly into the camera. She earned it. The video ended. Hugo lurched to his feet, and the security associate who had been standing quietly near the door moved forward with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before. Paige was already at the far end of the room, pulling on her coat, not looking at anyone. You cannot do this, Hugo said, his voice stripped of everything. You cannot. She was in my house. The will is legally sound, Reginald said, properly witnessed, notarized and recorded. Your mother was assessed as competent by 2 independent physicians. The documentation against you is substantial. I would strongly recommend retaining a criminal defense solicitor before anything else. He nodded to the associate. Please show Mr. Hadwick and Ms. Allard out. Hugo said something on the way out the door that Lenora didn't catch. Then the door closed and the room was quiet. Lenora sat without moving for a long time. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows she could see clouds moving fast across the North Shore Mountains, the kind of October sky that couldn't decide whether it was done raining. Reginald set a folder in front of her. When you're ready, he said. It took her 3 attempts to open it. The numbers didn't feel real. Hadwick Property Group assessed at $8.2 million, 3 additional properties in Millicent's personal name, investment accounts, GIC portfolios, every number, her name on every line. I don't know how to run a property company, Lenora said. Reginald allowed himself the smallest possible smile. Millicent anticipated you'd say exactly that. He produced a second envelope from his briefcase and set it on the table. She left this for you. The envelope had Lenora's name on the front in Millicent's handwriting, careful and slightly labored, the way it had looked in the last year, each letter separately committed to. Reginald stood. Take whatever time you need. He stepped out and closed the door behind him. Lenora held the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it. Lenora. Don't panic. I know you're panicking. First, Reginald is exceptional. He has managed this firm's legal affairs for 16 years and he will not let you flounder. Trust him the way you trusted me. Second, I spent 2 years teaching you what I knew about this business, even when you thought we were just talking. You listened, you asked the right questions. You retained everything. I know because I watched you do it. Third, and this is important, don't try to be me. I had 40 years and made 100 mistakes. Start fresh. The things that were wrong at the firm, the shortcuts Hugo cut, the clients he let down, fix them and fix them openly. People forgive mistakes. They do not forgive pretense. Fourth, sell the house. I know you know why. Fifth, give yourself time to grieve the marriage you thought you had. It was real to you, and that counts for something even now. Don't let anyone rush that part. You are 37 years old. I was 34 when I signed the papers on my first property. You have more time ahead of you than you can see right now. Build something beautiful. That's all I'm asking. With more love than I knew how to say out loud. Millicent. Lenora sat alone in the boardroom for a long time after that, the letter open in her hands, the mountains visible through the glass. She wasn't thinking about Hugo. She wasn't thinking about the properties or the firm or the number on the page. She was thinking about a cribbage game on a rainy Tuesday, and Millicent's voice saying never let anyone's small imagination become your ceiling. She thought, I didn't know that was a lesson, I just thought we were talking. When she finally stood and opened the boardroom door, Reginald was waiting in the hall with a coffee. He handed it to her without a word, in the way of someone who had been waiting long enough to understand what was needed. "All right," Lenora said, "tell me what I need to know." They spent 4 hours in that boardroom. Reginald walked her through everything: the company structure, the tenants, the contracts, the staff. He showed her who had stayed loyal to Millicent and who had quietly shifted to Hugo's side of things. He told her what to fix first and what could wait. Lenora asked questions until she ran out and then sat quietly until more arrived. At 3 in the afternoon, Reginald drove her to a hotel on Robson Street. She'd had her bag from the house in the car. She'd grabbed it on the way out that morning, not knowing then that she wouldn't be going back. The room was quiet and high and clean, and it looked over the city in a way the basement had not. She ordered room service. She ran a bath. She sat on the wide bed with Millicent's letter in her hand and let herself cry properly for the first time since all of it had begun. For the marriage. For the years she'd handed over. For the woman who had chosen her even when her own son had not. When she was done, she dried her face and opened her laptop. She began to write notes. 3 months later, Lenora had changed the locks on the Kitsilano house, put it on the market, and moved into a rented apartment on the east side with high ceilings and a small balcony, where she could see the mountains when the weather was clear. She'd hired an interim manager for the portfolio, a practical woman named Frances who'd spent 20 years in Vancouver commercial real estate, and who was entirely unsentimental about what needed to go and what needed to stay. She'd also filed a formal complaint with the Real Estate Council of BC regarding Hugo's billing practices. The RCMP file was already moving without her input. Hugo had been charged in November. He'd retained a lawyer, then fired the lawyer, then retained another. Paige Allard had given a statement and quietly left the firm. Lenora didn't track it closely. She had other things to attend to. The company's 3 longest-standing tenants had nearly walked when word got out about the ownership change. Lenora had gone to each one personally, sat across from them in their offices, listened to their concerns, told them plainly what had gone wrong under previous management and what she intended to do differently. She left each meeting with a handshake and a renewed lease. In March, a property manager on one of the East Van buildings came to her with an idea about converting a vacant commercial unit to subsidized workshop space for tradespeople starting out. He'd been sitting on the idea for 3 years, he said. He'd been afraid to bring it to Hugo. Lenora approved it in the same meeting. By spring, the portfolio was showing signs of steadying. Not recovered, that would take longer, and Lenora had stopped expecting things to happen overnight, but steadying. The kind of slow, real improvement that people who'd been around long enough could recognize for what it was. Frances told her over coffee one morning in April, "You're better at this than you think." "I'm making it up as I go," Lenora said. "That's what everyone's doing. The ones who admit it do better." The house sold in February, above asking, to a family from Edmonton relocating for work. Lenora had walked through it one last time before closing, empty of everything except the fitted shelving in Millicent's old room, which the new owners had asked to keep. She'd stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. "Thank you," she said to the empty space. "The way you say something when there's no one there to hear it, and you need to say it anyway." In May, Lenora was invited to speak at a Vancouver Commercial Real Estate Association luncheon. She almost declined. She was barely 6 months into running the company. She felt half-formed still. She went anyway. She told them she'd inherited the company under circumstances she wouldn't describe in detail. She told them she'd known nothing about property management when she started. She told them about Frances, and about the workshop conversion, and about the 3 tenants she'd nearly lost. She told them what Millicent had taught her, without quite explaining how she'd learned it. Afterward, a woman about her age came up and said, "I'm going through a divorce right now. My husband is trying to take the business we built together. I came here today because I didn't know what else to do." She looked at Lenora steadily. "I'm glad I came." Lenora thought about that conversation for days. The following autumn, she established a small mentorship program through the firm for women in the early stages of starting property businesses in the Lower Mainland. It wasn't large. She didn't have the capital yet for something large, but it was real, and it was the kind of thing that could grow. She named it after Millicent. She hadn't asked anyone's permission. She just did it, because it was right, and because Millicent had taught her that the simplest way to honor someone was to do the thing you knew they'd have wanted done. A year after the will reading, Lenora stood outside a small fourplex in Commercial Drive that she'd just signed the papers on, her first independent acquisition, Bought with her own decision and her own signature. The tenants were already in, the heat was working. Someone had planted something low and green along the front fence. She stood on the walk in her coat and looked at it for a long moment. She thought about a woman who had started this whole thing from a single fourplex in East Vancouver, 41 years ago, with $50,000, and a bank manager who didn't believe she understood real estate. She thought, I understand it now, Millicent. It was the 1st of October. The mountains were clear and close in the way they only get in autumn, the air stripped clean and cold. She pulled out her phone and took a photograph of the building. Small and unremarkable and entirely hers. With the mountains sitting in the background like they'd been placed there specifically for the occasion. She sent it to Reginald with no caption. He replied 3 minutes later with a single word, exactly. She put her phone in her pocket and walked back to her car. She had 2 more meetings in the afternoon and a lease negotiation at 4 and something on the stove at home that needed attending to by 6, and none of it was easy and all of it was hers. That was enough. That was more than enough. She was beginning to understand exactly what Millicent had always believed it would be.